Action Network. He came there at 15. An activist out there in Michigan. Well, you there, Julian?
Yeah,
There he is.
Looking good. Yes, we do.
Thanks, guys.
Did you see the? You didn't see the video. Could you see the video?
Yeah, Dr. King talking about the unequal treatment of African Americans as compared to other groups and what they're receiving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I'm going to give probably a legal perspective. I also want to acknowledge, you know, the person that spoke before is extremely passionate. I can't see you, but I mean, I really do miss that sense of passion. And,
Blessings, my brother.
no problem. I thought it was just an incredible answer.
He's out of Nan. He's out of Nan.
Thanks, man. Nah,
That's what Nan does to you.
yeah. But,
I'll say
you
that's
know,
what Jesus does to you.
Okay.
But you know, right now, where the courts are in regards to addressing racial inequality, there's a really weird mix of really having a higher burden when it comes to thinking about fundamental rights. Fundamental right is something for the audience to think about, where something that is so inherent to being an American citizen that it's something that's not even questioned. And you find that through maybe, you know, our history, certain sentiments that we possess, and so on. And the reason I'm talking about it is because we're going to talk about, for instance, like the Equal Protection Clause and due process clause, and thinking about ways in which we can address racial inequity through providing certain like government programs, as Dr. King is talking about. And these programs are just really hard to achieve, you know, because of the scrutiny standard that the Constitution or the Supreme Court has been placing on, you know, these pieces of legislation, where it's heightened scrutiny when it comes to addressing racial inequity. And with heightened scrutiny, it doesn't mean that something can't get passed through, legislation can get passed through to address these issues, but that they have to meet such a high bar that it makes it just so difficult to pass and to really state, even when it's passed, put in place. So for instance, with Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, the court ended up rejecting or cutting out Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act because they said that at the point in which the southern states had their black residents or white residents voting at the same point or at the same percentage, they were able to take away this piece of protection because it was not needed anymore. So
Yeah.
the court is kind of seeing in this weird place that they're looking at all the racial equality, quote unquote, that we're seeing within our country at this point, and the black president, maybe people like me being in spaces like this, and they're seeing that Martin's dream in their eyes is becoming made real. And you know, as we know, this is not the case. You know, black men disproportionately make up the prison population. We know that we disproportionately make up the poverty line. We disproportionately make up so many different elements. But, you know, Dr. King's point, you know, their vision of where we are is just so different to where we actually are. And they want to use the law to say that if they give us any protection as black people in that sense, or people of color in that sense, in the court's eyes, they might perceive it as reverse racist towards white Americans.
Yeah.
If we don't meet the heightened scrutiny. So I just want to put that.
Affirmative action has suddenly become reverse racism.
Right.
When
Exactly.
in the 70s, that, you know, that was the liberal sort of giving us a little bit of freedom. After Martin died in '68, things became a little bit more liberal for us. I know myself personally, I got an affirmative action in 1970s.
But more white women gained from affirmative action than any other group. And that's an absolute
Well, they
fact.
didn't get to vote until
And-
what year?
Well, the vote for women came in 1919 with Susan B. Anthony. But, you know, all of this, even the Emancipation Proclamation, that was written to the Confederate States of America.
Right.
there were 3 states in the Union that held slaves all through the Civil War: Delaware, West Virginia, and one other. Those slaves were not emancipated with the Emancipation Proclamation.
We could talk about Juneteenth, right?
Lincoln
That's the whole thing with
freed
Juneteenth.
nobody. He freed nobody. It wasn't until the end of the war that people got word of the Emancipation Proclamation in the South, and the 40 acres and the mule was not part of that. That was stated by General Sherman when he moved through and took Atlanta and all that land. Under the military code, General Sherman allocated land from the coast, I think 40 miles in, from Virginia down into northern Florida. And that was a military mandate, but he said that only held until the government was reestablished. So when the military left the South, the Negro had nothing. There was no protection for the Negro.
What
And
year was that?
That was from the end of the Civil War up until 1877, when they had the Compromise of 1877 with Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. And the Republicans gave the South back to the Confederate rebels, and they could then come back and take political office, and then the whole dynamic changed for black people in the South, because they were no longer allowed in state legislatures. They could no longer be a mayor, because all of these former Confederates, just as your January 6th people have done. You know, we've got people in Congress now who are part of that uprising.
Well, let's update ourselves today.
Can I say something too? I just want to add something really quickly. I'm so sorry. When it comes to addressing racial inequality in regards to how the government is treating certain groups of people, the government has an incredibly difficult standard. An incredibly difficult standard to pass legislation that will rectify certain inequities, because the standard is a 2-pronged test when there's equal protection violation being brought to the court, and that 2-pronged test is that whether or not something that's going on or some act has a discriminatory effect, and then on top of that, whether or not something has a discriminatory purpose, right? So it's very easy to show a discriminatory effect. So for instance, Dr. King saying, oh, this group's getting this, we're not getting that, they're improving, we're not improving. The difficulty in proving these cases, and I hope activists can try to do this and all that, the difficulty is, how do you make real that the action that the state is taking has a discriminatory purpose, that the people who did this piece of legislation are obviously doing it out of racial animus. And it is so difficult to prove that. And that's why it's really hard to get a lot of legislation passed, because the courts will say that legislation that's going directly towards one group is unconstitutional. They'll just call it like that and it will kill the bill. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, it's good that you're showing us all the games that are being played. And we need to know this, and we appreciate, Julian, you being where you are, because through this little translation here of what's happening to us and the different opinions that we have, we can see what sort of
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
But here at the Gilchrist Experience, we show all sides, and I like to we'll update ourselves to what happened